The flames licked at the night sky, consuming everything Katherine Morgan had ever known in an infuriating blaze that matched the color of her auburn hair. She stood frozen, barefoot in the dirt, clutching only the nightgown she wore and a locket containing her parents' photograph as the merciless fire devoured the small homestead that had been in her family for 2 generations. By dawn, nothing remained but smoldering ash and the crushing realization that at 22 years old, she was completely alone in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming. Empire City, Wyoming Territory, 1876, was a place built by stubborn souls who fought against nature's harshest conditions. Catherine Kate, to those who knew her, had been one such soul, until the fire stripped away everything but her determination. The town itself was little more than a collection of wooden structures straddling the dusty thoroughfare that connected the railroad to the vast ranching operations scattered across the rolling grasslands. The mountains loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of how small human struggles were against the vastness of the frontier. Miss Morgan, Sheriff Daniels approached carefully as Kate sifted through the charred remains of her home, desperately searching for anything salvageable. "I'm mighty sorry about your loss. The town's taking up a collection." Kate straightened her back, wiping soot from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She'd been given shelter at the Widow Harmon's boarding house for the time being, but charity wasn't what she needed. "Thank you, Sheriff, but I don't want handouts. I need to rebuild." The sheriff removed his hat, revealing a receding hairline that aged him beyond his 40 years. "That's a tall order for anyone, especially a woman on her own." "Perhaps you should consider, this land is all I have left of my family," Kate interrupted, her green eyes flashing with a determination that made the sheriff step back slightly. "I'm not leaving it." The sheriff nodded, replacing his hat. "Well then, I suppose you'll be needing help. I'll ask around town, see if anyone's willing to lend a hand." As the sheriff walked away, Kate returned to examining the charred remains of her home. The fire had started in the kitchen, a stray spark from the cook stove while she'd been fetching water, the sheriff had determined. Her father had built this place after returning from the war between the states, marrying her mother and settling in Empire City with dreams of raising horses. They'd managed to establish a modest breeding operation before a fever took them both 3 years earlier, leaving Kate to maintain their legacy alone. She'd done well enough until now. The small horse breeding business had provided a modest income, and she'd even expanded their reputation for quality stock. Now, though, she was left with nothing but the 3 horses that had been in the paddock far enough from the house to escape the blaze, her mare Penny, a promising young stallion called Thunder, and an aging gelding named Rusty. "You sure you're not hurt?" The voice startled Kate from her thoughts. She turned to find a tall man on horseback surveying the destruction. His dark hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of beard. His clothing was trail-worn but clean denim pants tucked into well-used boots, a blue cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. "I'm fine," Kate replied, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. She'd borrowed a dress from Mrs. Harmon that was too large around the waist and too short at the ankles. Her hair was hastily pinned up, with loose tendrils escaping in every direction, and she knew her face was streaked with ash. The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who lived in the saddle. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Patrick Garrett," he introduced himself. "Folks call me Pat. I run the G-Bar Ranch about 10 miles north." Kate had heard of the G-Bar, one of the larger cattle operations in the area. "Katherine Morgan," she replied, extending her hand automatically. "Kate," his hand engulfed hers, calloused and warm. "Sheriff mentioned what happened when I was in town picking up supplies." His eyes scanned the ruins thoughtfully. "Says you're planning to rebuild." "I am." Kate withdrew her hand, lifting her chin slightly. She'd had enough of men telling her what she should or shouldn't do. Her father had taught her to stand her ground, and she wouldn't back down now. To her surprise, Pat nodded. "It's good land." His gaze drifted to the 3 horses in the small corral. "Those yours?" "Yes, all that's left of my breeding stock, Morgan horses." It wasn't a question. "Your father had a reputation for fine animals." Pride straightened Kate's spine. "He did. I've maintained his standards." Pat circled the ruins slowly, assessing the damage. Foundation looks intact. Got a water source. There's a well behind where the house stood, and the creek runs along the north property line. He stopped beside her, hands on his hips as he surveyed the scene. Lumber's scarce around these parts, but there's a stand of pine in the foothills that would serve. Could have a basic structure up before winter sets in. Kate studied him cautiously. Why would you help me, Mr. Garrett? We're strangers. Pat replaced his hat, adjusting it against the sun. My pa always said you measure a community by how it treats those in need. He shrugged broad shoulders. Besides, I could use a few of those Morgan horses to improve my stock. We might be able to work out a trade. Before Kate could respond, Hoofbeats announced another arrival. Thomas Whitaker, the banker's son, rode up on his flashy bay gelding. At 26, Thomas had already positioned himself as his father's successor at the Empire City Bank, and his immaculate clothing and smooth hands spoke of a life lived in comfort. Katherine, he greeted her, not bothering to dismount. Father asked me to check on you. This is quite the tragedy. His eyes took in the destruction with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property value rather than human suffering. Please thank your father for his concern, Kate replied stiffly. The Whitakers had been trying to purchase her land for years, convinced its proximity to town made it valuable for future development. Thomas nodded toward Pat. Garrett, surprising to see you this far from your herd. Pat's expression remained neutral. Whitaker. Thomas returned his attention to Kate. Father would like me to remind you that our offer to purchase your property stands. In fact, given the circumstances, we're prepared to be quite generous. It would save you the trouble of rebuilding. Kate felt her temper flare. My answer hasn't changed, Thomas. This land isn't for sale. Thomas smiled thinly. Pride won't keep you warm when winter comes, Katherine. Think about it. You have no house, no barn. How will you survive? She'll rebuild, Pat interjected, his voice level but firm. And she won't be doing it alone. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Playing the hero, Garrett, how quaint. He tipped his hat. The offer remains open, Katherine. When reality sets in, you know where to find us. With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode toward town. Kate watched him go, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The Whitakers have wanted this land since before my father died. They think its location will be valuable once the railroad spur is completed. Pat nodded. That family's been trying to own all of Empire City since they opened that bank. He turned to her. I meant what I said. I'll help you rebuild if you'll allow it. Kate hesitated. She needed help that was undeniable, but accepting it from a man she barely knew went against her independent nature. Still, winter would come early to the Wyoming territory and she had little choice. What exactly would this trade entail, Mr. Garrett? Pat, he corrected. I help you rebuild, provide materials and labor. In exchange, I get first pick of your next 2 foal crops for my breeding program. Fair market value, of course. It was a reasonable offer, possibly even generous considering the circumstances. You have other men who would help. I've got 3 hands who'd be glad for the work. We're between seasons, cattle are fattening on summer grass, and the fall roundup is still a month away. It's as good a time as any. Kate considered his offer. She could use the help, and a business arrangement was far preferable to charity. I accept your offer, Pat. But I want it understood that I'll be working alongside you. This is my home, and I won't sit idle while others build it. A smile broke across his face, transforming his weathered features. Wouldn't expect anything less, Miss Morgan. He extended his hand, and they shook on it, sealing their agreement as the Wyoming sun beat down on the ashes of her former life. The next morning, Kate awoke before dawn in her small rented room at Mrs. Harmon's boarding house. Sleep had been elusive, her mind filled with worries about the future and memories of the past. She dressed quickly in the only other outfit she owned now, a simple skirt and blouse that Mrs. Harmon had altered for her the previous evening. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, Kate made her way to the general store to purchase necessary supplies. The proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, a balding man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. Morning, Miss Morgan. Terrible business, that fire. Just terrible. He shook his head sympathetically. What can I do for you today? I need tools, Mr. Jenkins. Basic ones to start clearing the property. Mr. Jenkins looked concerned. Clearing's hard work, Miss Morgan. Perhaps Patrick Garrett has offered to help rebuild. Kate interrupted, growing weary of everyone's doubts about her capabilities. "But I need to make a start today." At the mention of Pat's name, Mr. Jenkins' expression changed. "Garrett's a good man. Known him since he came to these parts 8 years ago, built that ranch from nothing after serving in the army." He nodded approvingly. "If he's helping, you're in good hands." Kate left the store with a shovel, hammer, and several other basic tools charged to an account Pat had apparently arranged that morning. His efficiency both impressed and slightly irritated her. She valued her independence fiercely, yet couldn't deny the practicality of his assistance. When she arrived at her property, Kate was surprised to find Pat already there with 2 of his ranch hands. They had begun clearing debris, loading charred timbers into a wagon. "Morning, Miss Morgan," Pat called, setting down a blackened beam. He wore a different shirt today, faded red flannel with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. "Hope you don't mind us making a start." "Not at all," Kate replied, trying to hide her surprise at their early arrival. "And please call me Kate." Pat nodded, then gestured to his companions. "This is Miguel Ramirez and Daniel Cooper, best hands on the G-bar." Miguel, a young man with quick dark eyes and an easy smile, tipped his hat. Miss Kate, Daniel, older with graying hair at his temples and a weathered face, nodded respectfully. "Madam, my third hand jack is bringing a load of tools and supplies," Pat explained. "Should be here shortly." Kate set down her newly purchased tools. "Where do you want me to start?" Pat looked momentarily surprised, as if he hadn't expected her to jump right in. "Well, we're sorting what can be salvaged. Metal items, hardware, anything the fire didn't destroy completely." For the next several hours, they worked systematically through the ruins. The summer sun climbed high, beating down mercilessly as they sifted through ash and debris. Kate found herself grateful for the wide-brimmed hat Pat had wordlessly handed her mid-morning. Around midday, Jack arrived with the promised wagon of supplies and additional tools. He was younger than the others, perhaps 19 or 20, with sandy hair and freckles across his nose. His enthusiastic greeting and ready smile brought a welcome lightness to the somber task. They broke for a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried beef that Miguel had packed. As they ate in the shade of a large oak that had survived the fire, Pat outlined his rebuilding plan. "Foundation's solid stone, which is fortunate. We'll need to lay new floor joists, then frame the walls." His hands sketched the structure in the air as he spoke. "I'm thinking we build it a bit larger than before with proper room for winter storage." Kate swallowed a bite of bread. "I can't afford anything elaborate, Pat. Simple and sturdy will do." "Nothing fancy," he agreed, "but winter's harsh in these parts, better to build right the first time." He pointed toward the mountains. "I'll take Miguel and Jack to that pine stand tomorrow, start cutting timber. Daniel can stay here with you, continue clearing and preparing the site." As the men returned to work, Kate found herself watching Pat. There was something compelling about the quiet confidence with which he approached the task. He didn't waste motion or words, and he treated his men with respect, working alongside them rather than merely directing their efforts. By late afternoon, they had cleared most of the debris and salvaged what little could be saved: some kitchen implements, a few metal tools, the iron cookstove that would need repairs but had survived the intense heat. Kate's muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, but she felt a sense of accomplishment as she surveyed the now empty foundation. "Good day's work," Pat commented, coming to stand beside her. He'd removed his hat, and sweat had darkened his hair at the temples. Dust and ash smudged his face, but his eyes remained strikingly blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Yes," Kate agreed, suddenly aware of how close he stood. She could smell the masculine scent of him: leather, horses, and honest sweat. It wasn't unpleasant. "Thank you, Pat. I couldn't have managed this alone." He replaced his hat, shielding his eyes from the setting sun. "We're just getting started, Kate, but you've got grit, I'll say that much. Not many would tackle what you did today without complaint." His compliment warmed her more than it should have. "My father didn't raise me to shrink from hard work. He raised you well." Pat glanced at her hands, now blistered from the day's labor. Without asking, he took one in his larger one, examining the damage. "You should soak these in cold water tonight. Tomorrow wear these." He pulled a pair of leather-work gloves from his back pocket. Kate wanted to refuse, to insist she didn't need special treatment, but practicality won out. Thank you. Pat released her hand slowly, almost reluctantly. We'll be back at first light. Try to get some rest. As he and his men packed up their tools and prepared to leave, Kate felt a strange emptiness at the thought of returning to her lonely room at the boarding house. The day's work had given her purpose, and Pat's steady presence had been oddly comforting. "Kate," Pat called as he mounted his horse. "Lock your door tonight," she frowned. "Is there reason for concern?" His expression was unreadable, just a feeling. Whitaker didn't seem pleased about our arrangement. After they departed, Kate tended to her horses, giving them extra attention to make up for the disruption to their routine. As she brushed Penny's gleaming coat, she found herself thinking about Pat Garrett. He was unlike any man she'd encountered in Empire City: direct, competent, without the condescension most men displayed toward her. Later, at the boarding house, Kate soaked her blistered hands as instructed. Mrs. Harmon, a kindly widow in her 50s, provided a salve made from herbs that soothed the raw skin. "Heard Patrick Garrett's helping rebuild your place," Mrs. Harmon remarked as she served dinner to her small group of boarders. "That man's a good sort. Came here after the war with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. Now runs one of the most successful cattle operations in the county." Kate's curiosity was piqued. "You've known him long, since he first arrived, stayed here for a few months while he was getting established, Mrs. Harmon smiled knowingly. "Handsome devil, isn't he? Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, but he keeps to himself mostly, focused on building that ranch." Kate felt her cheeks warm. "We have a business arrangement, Mrs. Harmon, nothing more." The older woman merely smiled. "Of course, dear. Pass the potatoes, would you?" That night, Kate lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house. Her hands still stung despite Mrs. Harmon's salve, and her muscles protested the day's exertion. Yet beneath the discomfort lay a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her parents' deaths. She would rebuild, and she would continue their legacy. Her thoughts drifted to Pat, his quiet strength, the unexpected gentleness when he'd examined her injured hands, the respect with which he'd treated her throughout the day. She told herself her interest was merely practical. She needed his help, after all. But as sleep finally claimed her, Kate couldn't deny that something about Patrick Garrett had awakened feelings she'd long thought dormant. Dawn broke clear and crisp the following morning. Kate arrived at her property to find Pat already there with his men, organizing the day's tasks. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, and she wondered if he'd gone home at all or simply camped nearby to get an early start. "Morning," he greeted her, blue eyes assessing her appearance. "Hands feeling better," Kate nodded, holding up the gloves he'd given her. "Much, and I came prepared today." Pat smiled, a brief flash of white teeth against his tanned face. "Good. Daniel will stay with you today to finish clearing and start digging post holes for the barn. The rest of us are heading to the timber stand." "I thought we'd rebuild the house first," Kate said, surprised. Pat shook his head. "Barn first, gives shelter to your horses and a place for you to sleep that's your own. Can build a small room in one corner for you until the house is done." His practicality made sense. "Very well, barn first." As the others prepared to leave, Kate approached Pat. "I want to come with you to cut timber." Pat paused in adjusting his horse's saddle. "It's rough country up there and rougher work." "These are my buildings, Patrick. I should have a say in selecting the materials." She met his gaze steadily. "Besides, I know how to use an axe." For a moment she thought he might refuse, then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough, can you ride astride? It's no country for side saddles." "Of course I can." Her father had taught her to ride properly, social conventions be damned. "I'll change and be ready in 10 minutes." Kate hurried to the small shed where she'd stored her few remaining possessions. Among them was a pair of her father's old trousers, which she'd occasionally worn when doing ranch work out of sight of town. They were too large, but with a belt and the cuffs rolled up, they would serve. She paired them with her blouse and boots, then braided her long auburn hair tightly to keep it out of her way. When she emerged, she caught Pat staring, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment she feared he disapproved, but then he simply nodded and helped her mount her mare. The ride to the timber stand took nearly 2 hours, climbing steadily into the foothills. Pat led the way, with Kate following and Miguel and Jack bringing up the rear with the wagon and draft horses. The air grew cooler as they ascended, fragrant with pine and sage. They reached a clearing near a stream where tall pines stood straight and true. Pat dismounted, helping Kate down though she could have managed alone. His hands lingered briefly at her waist before he stepped back. "These will do nicely," he said, surveying the trees. "Straight, mature, but not too old. The wood will be strong." For the next several hours, Kate worked alongside the men, helping to fell selected trees and strip branches once they were down. The work was indeed grueling, but she refused to show weakness, matching their pace as best she could. When they broke for a midday meal, she collapsed gratefully onto a fallen log, muscles trembling with exertion. Pat sat beside her, offering his canteen. "You're tougher than you look, Kate Morgan." She drank deeply before responding. "I told you I was no stranger to hard work." "That you did." He studied her face. "Your father taught you well. He believed women were capable of more than society gives us credit for." Kate wiped sweat from her brow. "After my mother died, he said he wouldn't always be around to take care of me, so I'd better learn to take care of myself." Wise man. Pat stretched his long legs before him. "My father was similar. Taught my sisters the same skills he taught me and my brothers. Said capability had nothing to do with whether you wore trousers or skirts." Kate looked at him with renewed interest. "You have family," a shadow crossed his face. "Had. Lost my parents to influenza in '67. My brothers both died in the war, one at Gettysburg, one at Cold Harbor. Sisters married and moved east. Haven't seen them in years." "I'm sorry." Kate understood the loneliness of being the last of one's family. It's hard being the one left behind. Pat nodded, his expression distant. "It is. Makes you determined to build something lasting, though, something that matters." They fell silent, the connection between them deepening in the shared understanding of loss. Around them, the forest hummed with life birds calling, the stream gurgling over rocks, the soft sigh of wind through pine needles. In that moment, Kate felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before the fire. The spell was broken when Jack approached, asking about which trees to fell next. The afternoon passed in continued labor, and by the time they loaded the first cut logs onto the wagon, the sun was sinking toward the western horizon. "We'll need to make several more trips," Pat said as they prepared to head back. "But this is a good start, enough for floor joists and some of the framing." The return journey was slower, the heavily loaded wagon requiring careful navigation down the slopes. Dusk had fallen by the time they reached Kate's property. Daniel had made significant progress, clearing the final debris and marking the outline for the new barn. "You should head back to town before it gets completely dark," Pat told Kate as they unloaded the timber. "I can help finish unloading," she protested, though exhaustion was evident in her voice. Pat shook his head firmly. "You've done more than enough today. Rest those muscles or you'll be too stiff to move tomorrow." Too tired to argue, Kate nodded. As she mounted Penny for the ride back to town, Pat approached and handed her something wrapped in cloth. "Salve for those muscles. Rub it in before you sleep, it helps." Kate accepted the bundle, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Pat, for everything today." He stepped back, one hand resting on Penny's neck. "Tomorrow we'll start setting the foundation posts for the barn. Wear those trousers again if you're comfortable. They're more practical for the work," Kate smiled. "I will. Good night, Pat." "Good night, Kate. Ride safe." As she made her way back to Empire City in the gathering darkness, Kate found herself looking forward to the next day with unexpected eagerness. The rebuilding of her home had begun, but she sensed that perhaps something else was being built as well, something less tangible but equally important. The next 2 weeks established a rhythm that quickly became familiar. Each day, Kate worked alongside Pat and his men, learning new skills as they steadily transformed the empty space where her home had stood into the framework of a new beginning. The barn took shape first, as Pat had planned. Sturdy pine posts sunk deep into the Wyoming soil, rough-hewn beams creating the skeleton of what would soon shelter her horses and, temporarily, herself. Kate discovered muscles she hadn't known she possessed, and each night she collapsed into bed at Mrs. Harmon's exhausted but satisfied. The physical labor was demanding, but it was the mental and emotional toll of rebuilding her life from ashes that truly challenged her. Each decision, where to place a window, how to arrange the stalls, whether to recreate her father's original designs or make adaptations, felt weighted with significance. She was not merely rebuilding structures but reshaping her future. Throughout it all, Pat was a steady presence. He worked tirelessly, his knowledge of construction proving invaluable. He was patient with her questions, respectful of her opinions, and seemed to genuinely value her input. The business arrangement that had initially defined their relationship gradually evolved into something resembling friendship, though Kate found herself increasingly aware of him in ways that went beyond mere appreciation for his skills. She noticed the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness of his large hands when tending to an injured fawn they'd discovered near the building site. She observed his leadership style with his men firm but fair, earning their respect rather than demanding it. And she admired how he treated her as an equal partner in the rebuilding process, neither coddling her because she was a woman nor pushing her beyond her capabilities. On a particularly hot afternoon, as they worked on framing the barn walls, Kate found herself pausing to watch Pat demonstrate a joining technique to young Jack. The two men stood in the partial shade of the newly raised center beam, their shirts darkened with sweat from the day's labor. Pat's patient explanation and Jack's eager attentiveness spoke to the mentor relationship that had clearly developed between them. "He's good with the boy," Daniel commented, coming to stand beside Kate. The older man had proven to be a quiet but observant presence over the past weeks. "He is," Kate agreed. "Jack seems to look up to him." Daniel nodded. "Boss gave him a chance when no one else would. Boy had some trouble in his past, nothing serious, just youthful mistakes. But folks around here have long memories. Pat judges a man by what he does now, not what he did before." Kate considered this new information. "He seems to inspire loyalty, because he's loyal himself." Daniel wiped his brow with a bandana. "After my wife died 3 years back, I took to the bottle pretty hard, would have drunk myself to death if Pat hadn't stepped in. Gave me purpose, reason to stay sober." The older man's weathered face softened with emotion. "There's not many like him, Miss Kate." Before Kate could respond, Pat called them over to help raise another wall section. The conversation lingered in her mind, however, adding another dimension to her understanding of Patrick Garrett. That evening, as they finished work for the day, Pat approached Kate with an unexpected invitation. "Some of us are heading into town tomorrow evening for supplies and maybe a meal at the hotel restaurant. Would you join us?" Kate hesitated, surprised. They had worked side by side for 2 weeks, but had maintained a certain professional distance. This invitation felt like a crossing of some unspoken boundary. Pat seemed to sense her uncertainty. "The boys want to celebrate getting the barn framed. Nothing fancy, just a decent meal not cooked over a campfire. Put that way, it seemed harmless enough. I'd like that, thank you." A smile brightened his features. "Good. We'll finish early tomorrow around 4, then head into town." The following day brought steady progress, with the last of the barn's wall frames secured by mid-afternoon. True to his word, Pat called a halt to work earlier than usual, giving everyone time to clean up before their excursion to town. Kate returned to the boarding house to wash away the day's dust and change into her one presentable dress, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Harmon had helped her alter from donated clothing. She arranged her hair in a neat bun, pinning it securely, and added her mother's locket, one of the few personal items she'd been wearing the night of the fire. When she stepped onto the porch of the boarding house, she found Pat waiting, mounted on his bay gelding. He'd cleaned up as well, exchanging his work clothes for a fresh shirt and vest. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he'd trimmed his beard. The sight of him caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. "You look nice," he said simply, dismounting to help her onto Penny. "As do you," she replied, suddenly shy. "Where are the others?" "Meeting us at the hotel." He handed her the reins. "Thought you might appreciate an escort." They rode side by side down Empire City's Main Street, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare. The small town bustled with activity. The daily stage had just arrived, disgorging passengers and mail at the depot, and ranchers and farmers conducted end-of-day business before heading home. Several people called greetings to Kate, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. News of Pat's help with rebuilding her home had spread, generating inevitable gossip. Kate held her head high, determined not to give the town busybodies additional fodder for speculation. The hotel restaurant was Empire City's finest dining establishment, which wasn't saying much. Still, the tables wore clean cloths, the silverware shone, and the smell of cooking food was enticing after weeks of simple fare. Miguel, Daniel, and Jack waited at a corner table, all three looking somewhat uncomfortable in their town clothes. The meal was pleasant, with conversation flowing easily after initial awkwardness dissipated. Kate found herself laughing at Miguel's stories of ranch mishaps and Jack's enthusiastic descriptions of his first cattle drive. Even taciturn Daniel contributed occasional dry observations that revealed a sharp wit beneath his quiet exterior. Throughout the meal, Kate was acutely aware of Pat beside her, the brush of his arm against hers when he reached for the salt, the rumble of his laughter at his men's antics, the warmth of his presence. He seemed different here, more relaxed perhaps, his usual intensity softened by the casual setting. As they finished their apple pie, the hotel owner's wife approached their table. "Miss Morgan, it's good to see you out and about. We were also sorry to hear about your misfortune." Kate forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. The rebuilding is coming along well, thanks to Mr. Garrett and his men." Mrs. Peterson's gaze flitted between Kate and Pat, barely concealing her curiosity. "How fortunate you found such help." "Mr. Whittaker mentioned at the Ladies' Aid Society that he'd offered to purchase your property, said it would save you the trouble of rebuilding." Kate felt Pat stiffen beside her. "My land isn't for sale," she replied firmly. "My home will be rebuilt before the first snow." The older woman's expression turned skeptical. "Well, that's very ambitious. Winter comes early in these parts, as I'm sure Mr. Garrett has mentioned." Her tone suggested doubt about both the timeline and perhaps the nature of Pat and Kate's relationship. Pat spoke before Kate could respond. "Miss Morgan's barn is already framed, Mrs. Peterson. The house foundation will be laid next week. We'll have her settled well before the first frost." Something in his tone discouraged further comment. Mrs. Peterson offered a tight smile. "How lovely. Well, enjoy your evening." She bustled away toward another table. "Town gossips," Daniel muttered when she was out of earshot. "Can't mind their own business." "It's not worth worrying about," Kate said, though the encounter had left her feeling exposed. Every action in a small town was subject to scrutiny and interpretation, especially for a single woman in her position. After dinner, the men excused themselves to purchase supplies at the general store before it closed. Kate was about to join them when Pat touched her elbow lightly. "Would you walk with me a moment?" he asked quietly. Curious, Kate nodded. They stepped out onto the hotel's small veranda where the evening air had cooled with the setting sun. A few stars had appeared in the eastern sky, with more emerging as daylight faded. "I wanted to apologize for Mrs. Peterson," Pat said after a moment. "People in small towns can be nosy," Kate suggested with a small smile. His answering smile was warm. "I was going to say overly concerned with others' business, but nosy covers it." He leaned against the porch railing, his expression turning serious. "Does it bother you, the talk?" Kate considered the question. "I've never much cared what people think. My father used to say those who matter don't mind, and those who mind don't matter." Wise words. Pat's gaze held hers. "But I wouldn't want our arrangement to damage your reputation." Kate felt a flare of irritation. "My reputation? Pat, I lost my home, not my virtue. I'm rebuilding with your help, not." She stopped, embarrassed by the direction her thoughts had taken. "Not taking advantage of your charity," Pat finished for her, though she suspected he knew that wasn't what she'd been about to say. "I know that, Kate, but small towns have big imaginations." "Let them talk," Kate said firmly. "I know the truth, and so do you. That's what matters." Pat studied her face in the gathering darkness, his expression unreadable. "You're a remarkable woman, Katherine Morgan." The way he said her full name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, the hotel door opened, spilling light and noise onto the veranda as other patrons emerged. The moment broken, Pat straightened. "We should join the others. They'll be waiting." As they walked toward the general store, Kate found herself wondering what might have happened if they'd had a few more minutes alone. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. The next morning brought a change to their established routine. As Kate arrived at the building site, she found Pat deep in conversation with a tall stranger. The man's expensive clothing and city bearing marked him as an outsider to Empire City. "Kate," Pat greeted her, gesturing her over. "This is Edward Fleming from the railroad company." "Mr. Fleming, Miss Katherine Morgan." The stranger tipped his hat politely. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Garrett has been telling me about your unfortunate circumstances." Kate glanced questioningly at Pat. "Mr. Fleming is here about the proposed railroad spur," Pat explained. "The one the Whitacres have been lobbying for." Understanding dawned. Thomas Whitaker's interest in her property suddenly made more sense. If the railroad planned to extend a line through Empire City, her land's location would indeed become valuable. "The company is surveying possible routes," Fleming continued. "One option would cut directly through your property, Miss Morgan. I understand the Whitakers have approached you about selling." "They have," Kate confirmed. "And I've declined." Fleming nodded, unsurprised. "As is your right, of course. However, you should be aware that the railroad has certain legal options when it comes to securing necessary routes." Pat's expression darkened. "You're talking about eminent domain." "A regrettable but sometimes necessary measure," Fleming agreed smoothly. "Progress requires sacrifices, Mr. Garrett." Kate felt cold despite the morning sun. "Are you threatening to take my land, Mr. Fleming?" The railroad man looked pained. "Not threatening, Miss Morgan, simply making you aware of possibilities. The railroad prefers voluntary sales." "And if I continue to refuse?" Kate held his gaze steadily. "Then the matter would likely be settled in court. Such proceedings can be lengthy and costly." Fleming's implication was clear. A woman in Kate's position could ill afford legal battles against the powerful railroad. Pat stepped forward slightly, his stance protective though he didn't touch Kate. "I believe Miss Morgan has made her position clear, Fleming. If the railroad wants to discuss routes that don't involve seizing property from fire victims, we'd be happy to have that conversation." Fleming's expression hardened briefly before smoothing into practiced cordiality. "Of course, I'm merely presenting information." He handed Kate a card. "Should you reconsider, the company's offer would be quite generous, more than the Whitakers proposed, I assure you." After the railroad man departed, Kate turned to Pat. "Did you know about this?" Pat shook his head. "Not specifically. There have been rumors about the spur line for months, but nothing concrete. Fleming approached me in town this morning, asked about you and your property. I thought it better to bring him here, let you speak for yourself." Kate appreciated his respect for her autonomy, even as worry gnawed at her. "Can they really take my land through the courts?" "They can try," Pat said grimly, "but it's not as simple as Fleming made it sound. They need to prove necessity, offer fair compensation. It would take time." "Time we can use to finish rebuilding," Kate said determinedly. "If my property is established, working, it would be harder for them to justify taking it, wouldn't it?" Pat nodded, admiration evident in his expression. "It would, and I know a lawyer in Cheyenne who specializes in landowner rights against the railroads, fought them successfully several times." Kate squared her shoulders. "Then we continue as planned. I won't be bullied off my land, Pat." His smile was slow and approving. "I never thought you would be." The railroad threat added urgency to their work. Over the next week, they completed the barn with renewed determination. The structure took shape rapidly, walls enclosed, roof shingled, stalls built for the horses. Pat and his men constructed a small room in one corner as planned, complete with a proper bed, small stove, and basic furniture salvaged from town donations. The day Kate moved out of Mrs. Harmon's boarding house and into her new quarters was momentous. Though simple, the room represented the first tangible step in reclaiming her independence. Pat had insisted on certain comforts: glass in the small window rather than oiled paper, a sturdy lock on the door, shelves for her few possessions. These thoughtful details touched Kate deeply. "It's perfect," she told him as they stood in the completed space. Evening sunlight filtered through the window, casting warm patterns on the plank floor. "Better than I could have hoped for." Pat looked pleased. "It's temporary, mind you, the house will be much nicer. But this is mine. Something rebuilt from the ashes." Kate ran her hand along the smooth wooden shelf he'd crafted himself. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." "It's more than adequate." His voice had softened. "Seeing you rebuild your life, it's inspiring, Kate." Something in his tone made her turn to face him fully. The small room suddenly felt intimate, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Pat stood close enough that she could see the varying shades of blue in his eyes, the tiny scar near his right temple, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. "Pat," she began, uncertain what she meant to say. A shout from outside broke the moment Daniel calling that the horses were settled in their new stalls. Pat stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should let you get settled. We'll start on the house foundation tomorrow." Kate nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. "I'll see you in the morning." That night, her first in her rebuilt home, Kate lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of horses moving in their stalls. The small room was cozy, protected from the increasingly cool autumn nights. Outside, an owl called, reminding her that life continued despite loss and change. Her thoughts drifted to Pat, as they increasingly did during quiet moments. She could no longer pretend that her feelings were merely gratitude or friendship. Something deeper had developed, something that both excited and frightened her. Since her parents' deaths, Kate had guarded her heart carefully, focusing on survival and independence rather than emotional attachments. Pat Garrett represented a potential vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. Did he feel the same? There were moments when she thought so, the lingering glances, the gentle touches that weren't strictly necessary, the way he seemed to seek out her company even after long days of working side by side. Yet he maintained a certain reserve, never crossing the invisible line between business arrangement and something more personal. Kate sighed, turning on her narrow bed. Perhaps it was better this way. Once her home was rebuilt, their arrangement would conclude. She would resume her horse breeding business, he would return to his full-time ranch responsibilities, and life would continue as before. The thought left her with an unexpected emptiness. Fall progressed, the days growing shorter and the nights crisper as they began work on the house itself. The foundation was laid, sturdy and square, slightly larger than the original as Pat had suggested. Floor joists and subfloor followed, then wall framing. Each day brought visible progress, the skeleton of Kate's new home rising steadily from the ground where ashes had lain just weeks before. Working on the house brought Pat and Kate into even closer proximity. The nature of the construction required coordination and communication, often finding them working in tandem to hold boards in place, measure spaces, or discuss design decisions. These shared tasks created a rhythm between them, a partnership that felt increasingly natural. One afternoon, as they worked on framing an interior wall, Kate noticed Pat watching her with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked, pausing with hammer in hand. "Have I done something wrong?" Pat shook his head. "Just thinking about how far we've come since that first day. Remember how you looked standing in the ashes?" Kate remembered all too clearly the devastation, the overwhelming loss, the uncertainty of her future. "I was lost." "No," Pat contradicted gently. "You were determined. Even then, I could see it in your eyes you weren't going to be beaten by fire or anything else." His perception touched her. "I didn't feel very brave. Bravery isn't about not feeling fear, it's about what you do despite it." Pat's gaze held hers. "You're the bravest person I know, Kate Morgan." The compliment warmed her from within. "If I've shown courage, it's partly because you gave me reason to hope again, Pat." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. He stepped closer, one hand rising to gently brush a strand of hair from her cheek. The touch lingered, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "Kate," he began, his voice low and uncertain, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Pat dropped his hand and stepped back as if burned, turning toward the sound with evident frustration. Thomas Whitaker rode into the yard, accompanied by Edward Fleming from the railroad and another man Kate didn't recognize. The trio surveyed the construction with obvious surprise. "Miss Morgan," Fleming called as he dismounted, "I see you've been busy." Kate straightened, suddenly conscious of her work clothes and disheveled appearance. "Mr. Fleming, this is unexpected," Fleming gestured to his companion. "This is Mr. Henry Porter, attorney for Western Pacific Railroad. We've come to discuss the matter of your property." The third man, middle-aged with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, nodded curtly. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Garrett." Pat moved to stand beside Kate, his presence reassuring. "What's to discuss?" Miss Morgan has made her position clear. Thomas Whitaker's smile didn't reach his eyes. Circumstances have changed, Garrett. The Railroad Commission has approved the spur line route through Empire City. Construction begins next spring. Kate felt her stomach tighten. That doesn't change my decision, Mr. Whitaker. My land is not for sale. The attorney, Porter, stepped forward. Perhaps we should discuss this more privately, Miss Morgan. The railroad's position is legally quite strong, but we're prepared to be extremely generous in our compensation. Anything you have to say can be said here, Kate replied firmly. Mr. Garrett is my business partner in this matter. Porter looked skeptical but continued. Very well. The proposed route passes directly through your eastern acreage, the most logical and economically feasible path given the terrain. The railroad is prepared to offer 3 times the property's market value. Despite herself, Kate was momentarily stunned by the figure Porter named. It was indeed generous enough to purchase a new property elsewhere and still have substantial funds remaining. Pat's voice cut through her thoughts. And if she refuses, Porter's expression hardened. Then the railroad will file for compulsory purchase under eminent domain. Miss Morgan would receive only standard compensation, determined by court assessment. Additionally, she would bear her own legal costs, which could be substantial. That sounds remarkably like a threat, Pat observed, his tone deceptively casual though Kate could sense his anger. Simply reality, Mr. Garrett. Porter adjusted his spectacles. Progress cannot be impeded by individual interests. The greater good must prevail. Thomas Whitaker stepped forward, his expression sympathetic though his eyes remained cold. Katherine, be reasonable. You're rebuilding a life here against impossible odds. Why fight this battle when you could start fresh elsewhere, financially secure? Kate looked from Whitaker to Fleming to Porter, then at the partially built house behind them, the tangible evidence of her determination to reclaim her life on her own terms. Finally, she looked at Pat, whose steady gaze conveyed confidence in whatever decision she made. Gentlemen, she said at last, I understand your position and I understand the concept of the greater good, but this land represents more than property to me. It's my heritage, my family's legacy, and my future. She took a deep breath. I will not sell. If you wish to pursue legal action, you may do so, but I will fight you every step of the way. Fleming and Porter exchanged glances. Thomas Whitaker's face darkened with barely concealed anger. This is foolishness, Katherine. You cannot win against the railroad. Perhaps not, Pat interjected. But she won't fight alone. He turned to Porter. I suggest you contact James Montgomery in Cheyenne before you file any legal documents. He's Miss Morgan's attorney in this matter. Kate kept her expression neutral, though Pat's mention of the lawyer he'd previously referenced now claimed as her actual representative was a surprise. Porter frowned. Montgomery, the man's a notorious obstructionist in railroad matters. He's also highly effective, Pat replied smoothly. And as Miss Morgan's legal counsel, he'll be interested to hear about this conversation, particularly the implied threats. A tense silence followed. Finally, Fleming sighed. We had hoped to resolve this amicably, Miss Morgan. Please reconsider your position. The offer remains open for 30 days. After the unwelcome visitors departed, Kate released a shaky breath. Do I actually have an attorney named Montgomery, or was that a bluff? Pat's grim expression softened slightly. James Montgomery is real enough and the best land rights attorney in the territory. I sent him a letter after Fleming's first visit, explaining your situation. Haven't heard back yet, but he's a busy man. You did that without telling me. Kate wasn't sure whether to be touched by his foresight or irritated by his presumption. I didn't want to worry you until necessary. Pat had the grace to look slightly abashed. Should have mentioned it. I'm sorry, Kate sighed. No, you were right to be proactive. I just don't know if I can afford an attorney of that caliber. Montgomery often takes cases against the railroads on contingency. Their bullying tactics offend his sense of justice. Pat hesitated. And if money becomes an issue, I can help. Pat, you've already done so much. This is different, he interrupted. This is about your future, Kate, and… He paused, seeming to struggle with his words, and I've come to care about what happens to you more than I probably should. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither had openly acknowledged until now. Kate's heart raced as she met his gaze. I've come to care about you too, she said softly, more than I expected to. Pat stepped closer, reaching for her hand. Kate, boss. Miguel's voice called from the direction of the road. Wagons here with the window glass. Pat closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. Timing, he muttered, then called back. Be right there. He looked back at Kate, regret in his eyes. We should talk. Later, when we can be private. Kate nodded, both nervous and excited at the prospect. Later, she agreed, but later proved elusive. The delivery required immediate attention, and by the time the fragile glass was safely stored, other interruptions followed. Daniel needed guidance on a roofing question. Jack managed to injure himself with a misplaced hammer blow, and the day slipped away without another opportunity for private conversation. As evening approached, Pat was called away by an unexpected messenger from his ranch, something about a problem with the cattle that required his immediate attention. He left reluctantly, promising to return the next day, the unfinished conversation between them creating a new tension that both recognized but neither could address. That night, alone in her small room in the barn, Kate found sleep impossible. The railroad threat loomed large in her thoughts, but even more consuming was the almost conversation with Pat. What had he intended to say? Where might their admissions of caring lead? For the first time since the fire, Kate allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than mere survival, one that potentially included Patrick Garrett as more than a business partner or friend. The following morning brought heavy clouds and a biting wind, the first real harbinger of the approaching winter. Kate woke early, feeding and watering her horses before starting a pot of coffee on her small stove. The barn was snug against the weather, another testament to Pat's thorough work. Pat and his men arrived later than usual, their expressions somber. Pat himself looked tired, as if he hadn't slept. Everything all right at the ranch? Kate asked as he accepted the cup of coffee she offered. Rustlers, he replied grimly. Took 15 head of prime cattle. We tracked them partway but lost the trail in the dark. Sheriff's been notified. Kate frowned. That's concerning. Do you need to stay at your ranch today? We can manage here. Pat shook his head. Daniel and Jack will head back to keep watch. Miguel will stay with us. The house is too close to completion to delay now, with winter coming on. They worked steadily through the morning despite the threatening weather, focusing on enclosing the structure to protect against the coming storm. By midday, fat snowflakes had begun to fall, accumulating quickly on the freshly laid shingles and bare ground. First snow, Pat observed, looking skyward. Earlier than usual, Kate nodded, pulling her coat tighter. My father always said the first snow speaks to the winter's character. Early snow means a hard season ahead. Your father was right about many things, Pat agreed. He'd been somewhat distant all morning, focused intently on the work but saying little beyond necessary instructions. Kate wondered if he regretted his near admission the previous day. As the snowfall intensified, Pat made the decision to cease work for the day. No sense risking the glass installation in this weather. We'll continue tomorrow if it clears. Miguel departed for the ranch, leaving Pat and Kate alone at the property. An awkward silence fell between them as they stood in the shelter of the barn doorway, watching the snow transform the landscape into a world of white. You should head back to your ranch too, Kate suggested, though the thought of his departure left her strangely bereft. The roads will worsen if this continues. Pat turned to her, his expression unreadable. I will, but first I think we have a conversation to finish. Kate's pulse quickened. Yes, I believe we do. Pat guided her inside the barn, closing the door against the growing storm. In the lantern-lit interior, with horses shuffling contentedly in their stalls and snow pattering softly on the roof, he faced her with newfound resolve. I'm not a man of fancy words, Kate, never have been. He removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. But these past weeks working beside you, seeing your strength and determination, it's changed something in me. Kate waited, hardly daring to breathe. When I offered to help rebuild your home, it was partly neighborly duty, partly business arrangement, he continued. I didn't expect to find myself looking forward to each day simply because it meant seeing you. Didn't expect to lie awake thinking about your smile or the way you laugh or how right it feels when we're working side by side. His honesty stole her breath. Pat, he held up a hand. Please let me finish while I have the courage. He took a deep breath. Katherine Morgan, I've fallen in love with you. I know it's sudden, perhaps inappropriate given our arrangement. I know you might not feel the same. But with everything you're facing the railroad, winter coming, I wanted you to know you're not alone. Not just in the practical matters, but in everything if you'll have me." The declaration hung in the air between them, raw and honest and a little frightened. Pat stood before her not as the confident rancher who had first offered his help, but as a man laying his heart bare, uncertain of its reception. Kate stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "When the fire took everything, I thought I had nothing left but determination and two hands to rebuild with," she said softly. "I was wrong. I had more the capacity to recognize a good man when he appeared in my life, the courage to accept help without seeing it as weakness, and the heart to fall in love even when I thought I'd sealed it away." Hope dawned in Pat's eyes. "Kate, are you saying, 'I love you too, Patrick Garrett'?" The words, finally spoken aloud, felt like coming home. "I think perhaps I have for weeks now, but I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself." Pat's smile transformed his face, years seeming to fall away as he reached for her. His hands cradled her face with exquisite gentleness, as if she were something precious and fragile. "May I kiss you, Kate?" In answer, she rose on tiptoes, meeting him halfway as his lips found hers. The kiss was tender at first, almost reverent, but deepened as she wound her arms around his neck. His embrace was warm and solid, grounding her even as her heart soared. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted, his voice husky. Kate smiled, feeling happier than she had in years. "I'm glad you finally did." Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a cocoon of white around the barn. Inside, warmed by lantern light and newfound love, Kate and Pat talked as they never had before about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. He told her about his time in the army, the loneliness of building his ranch alone, the emptiness of success with no one to share it. She shared stories of her parents, her determination to honor their legacy, her secret fears after the fire that she might not be strong enough to rebuild. As evening deepened into night and the storm showed no signs of abating, it became clear that Pat couldn't safely return to his ranch. "I should check the horses one last time, then try to get some sleep in the tack room," he said reluctantly. Kate took his hand. "Or you could stay with me." At his surprised look, she clarified, "Just to sleep, Pat, but I don't want to be apart from you tonight, not when we've finally found each other." The small room she'd been occupying was indeed just that small. The narrow bed barely accommodated one person, let alone two. But they managed. Kate nestled against Pat's chest, his arms around her as if he feared she might disappear. They talked until drowsiness overtook them, exchanging soft kisses and whispered words of affection that seemed almost magical in the lantern-lit darkness. Just before sleep claimed her, Kate marveled at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a few short weeks. From utter devastation to unexpected joy, from isolation to profound connection. As Pat's breathing deepened into sleep beside her, she offered a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever fate or providence had brought him into her life. Morning brought clearing skies and a transformed landscape. 6 inches of snow blanketed the property, glistening in the early sunlight. Despite the cramped sleeping arrangements, Kate woke feeling more rested than she had in months, secure in Pat's embrace and the knowledge of their shared feelings. They rose early, sharing a simple breakfast before Pat reluctantly announced he needed to return to his ranch to check on his men and cattle. "I'll be back by midday," he promised, kissing her gently before mounting his horse. "The snow won't delay us much, it'll melt quickly once the sun's been on it a while." Kate watched him ride away, then turned to survey the property with new eyes. The partially completed house no longer represented merely her determination to rebuild what was lost. Now it symbolized the future she and Pat might build together. The thought both thrilled and frightened her, so much had changed so quickly. True to his word, Pat returned a few hours later with Miguel and additional supplies. Work on the house resumed with renewed energy, their shared secret lending a special warmth to even the most mundane tasks. Though they maintained professional decorum while working, their occasional exchanged glances and accidental touches spoke volumes. Over the next 2 weeks, the house rapidly neared completion. Walls were fully enclosed, the roof made weather-tight, glass installed in windows, and a proper stone chimney constructed. Inside, floors were laid, walls plastered, and simple furnishings added. It wasn't elaborate, but it was solid, comfortable, and most importantly, it was home. Throughout this period, Pat divided his time between Kate's property and his ranch responsibilities, often working from dawn until dusk, before riding the 10 miles back to the G-Bar. Though he never spent another night in her small room, both agreed that would invite too much gossip until their relationship was formally acknowledged. They stole precious moments of privacy whenever possible. During this time, a letter arrived from James Montgomery, the attorney Pat had contacted. The lawyer confirmed his willingness to represent Kate against the railroad's eminent domain claim, expressing confidence in their position given the historical significance of the property and the existence of alternative routes that would cause less disruption to established homesteads. His letter provided a detailed strategy for fighting the railroad's petition when it inevitably came, offering Kate her first real hope that she might retain her full property. "Montgomery doesn't take cases he doesn't think he can win," Pat assured her after reading the letter. "This is good news, Kate." Kate felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Even if we don't win completely, buying time means we can finish rebuilding before any legal proceedings conclude. That strengthens our position." Pat smiled, pride evident in his expression. "You're becoming quite the strategist." "I had a good teacher," she replied, returning his smile. "Someone who showed me that standing your ground doesn't mean standing alone." The house was completed as November drew to a close. Kate moved from her temporary quarters in the barn to the finished structure with a sense of triumph and gratitude. The new house resembled her original home in basic layout, but featured several improvements: larger windows to admit more light, a more efficient kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Most importantly, it was built to last, with quality materials and expert craftsmanship that would withstand Wyoming's harsh elements for generations to come. The evening after she moved in, Pat arranged a small celebration. He arrived at dusk with Miguel, Daniel, and Jack in tow, all bearing gifts for the new home: a handcrafted rocking chair, patchwork quilts sewn by Daniel's sister, a set of curtains commissioned from the dressmaker in town. "A proper housewarming," Pat explained as they unloaded the wagon. "Every new home deserves one." Kate was deeply touched by their thoughtfulness. "I don't know how to thank you all. You've given me back so much more than just walls and a roof." "No thanks needed, Miss Kate," Daniel said gruffly. "Been a pleasure seeing this place rise from ashes." Miguel nodded agreement. "Besides, Boss has been happier these past weeks than we've seen him in years. That alone was worth the work." Pat looked slightly embarrassed by this observation, but didn't deny it. Instead, he produced a final package from the wagon: a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with an intricate carving of horses on the lid. "Something special," he said, presenting it to Kate, "for your new beginning." Inside, Kate found a silver picture frame containing a sketch of her original home, clearly drawn from memory by someone with considerable artistic skill. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the lines with her finger. "How did you? Jack's been keeping it a secret," Pat explained, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "Turns out he's quite the artist. He worked from my descriptions and what was left of the foundation." Jack shuffled his feet, clearly pleased but embarrassed by the attention. "Wanted you to have something to remember it by, Miss Kate, while you build new memories in this one." After a festive meal in the new kitchen, the men having brought provisions as well as gifts, Miguel, Daniel, and Jack tactfully departed, leaving Pat and Kate alone in her new home. They sat before the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the quiet companionship that had become so precious to them both. "It feels like a dream," Kate said softly, watching the flames dance. "A few months ago I stood in ashes, thinking everything was lost. Now." She gestured around the cozy room, then to Pat beside her. "Now I have more than I ever imagined possible." Pat took her hand, entwining their fingers. "You rebuilt, Kate, with your own determination and courage. I just provided some extra hands. You provided far more than that." She turned to face him fully. "You gave me hope when I needed it most, partnership when I felt alone, and love when I least expected it." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it tenderly. I never thought I'd find someone like you, Kate. Someone who matches me stride for stride, who challenges and inspires me. Building this house with you has been the most meaningful work of my life." In the firelight, his eyes held a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "The house is finished," she observed. "Our business arrangement is technically complete, so it is." A smile tugged at his lips. "I suppose that means I'll need to find other reasons to visit you every day." Kate's heart quickened. "Did you have something in mind?" Pat shifted, turning to face her more directly. "As a matter of fact, I do." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the firelight. "I've been carrying this for a week now, waiting for the right moment." Kate's breath caught as she recognized a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that sparkled in the firelight. "Katherine Morgan," Pat began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have shown me what I was missing in my life. Working beside you, watching you face every challenge with grace and determination, falling in love with your spirit and your heart. It's changed me in ways I never expected." He took a deep breath. "I know this may seem sudden to others, but when you know, you know. And I know that I want to build a life with you, not just houses and barns, but a future, a family, a legacy that combines what's best in both of us." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me, Kate? Will you make me the happiest and most fortunate man in Wyoming territory?" Tears of joy filled Kate's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more confidently, "Yes, Patrick Garrett, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. The moment the ring was in place, Pat pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that expressed all the joy, love, and promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both breathless and smiling, Pat rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably speak with the Reverend tomorrow," he said softly. "Unless you want a long engagement," Kate laughed, happiness bubbling up from deep within her. "Haven't we waited long enough? Besides, winter's coming. Practical considerations suggest we shouldn't maintain two separate households through the cold months." "Practical considerations," Pat repeated, his eyes twinkling. "Is that what we're calling it?" She swatted his arm playfully. "Among other things." "But seriously, Pat, I don't need a fancy wedding or elaborate preparations. Just you, me, and whoever you want to stand witness." 2 weeks from today, then," he decided. "Time enough for basic arrangements, but not so long that I go mad waiting to make you my wife." They spent the remainder of the evening discussing plans, practical matters like where they would live. Kate's newly rebuilt home for now, with improvements to the G-Bar main house planned for spring. How they would manage their combined business interests. Pat's cattle operation and Kate's horse breeding complemented each other well. And when they would announce their engagement to the town immediately to prevent gossip about Pat's frequent visits. When Pat finally took his reluctant leave, propriety still demanded some separation. Until their wedding, Kate stood on her new porch watching him ride away, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight, a tangible symbol of the love and future they had forged from tragedy. News of their engagement spread quickly through Empire City. Most reactions were positive. Pat was well respected in the community, and many had witnessed Kate's determination and courage during the rebuilding. The consensus was that they made a well-matched pair, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. Not everyone celebrated their happiness, however. Thomas Whitaker made his disapproval known through thinly veiled comments about hasty decisions and convenient arrangements. The implication that Kate had agreed to marry Pat for financial protection against the railroad's threats infuriated them both, though they did their best to ignore the gossip. 2 days before the wedding, James Montgomery arrived in Empire City to discuss the railroad situation in person. The lawyer, a tall, dignified man with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes, met with Kate and Pat in her new home, reviewing documents and strategy. "The railroad's position isn't as strong as they'd have you believe," Montgomery assured them. "Their preferred route through your property is convenient but not necessary. Alternative routes exist that would require minimal additional expense. But they're determined," Pat pointed out. "Fleming and Porter made that clear." Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed." "Which suggests other motivations." He shuffled through his papers. I've been investigating connections between Western Pacific Railroad and certain local interests. It seems the Whitacres stand to gain considerably if your property becomes railroad land. Kate frowned. Beyond the obvious real estate speculation, Thomas Whitaker Sr. sits on the Regional Development Board that will determine placement of depots, loading facilities, and other infrastructure, Montgomery explained. Those decisions involve substantial contracts and influence land values throughout the area. Pat's expression darkened. So this isn't just about a convenient route, it's about power and profit for the Whitacres. Precisely. Montgomery gathered his papers. I've requested a formal hearing before the Territorial Commission. It's scheduled for January. Until then, they cannot legally proceed with any action against your property. The lawyer's visit provided reassurance, but also confirmed the battle ahead. That evening, after Montgomery departed for his hotel, Kate and Pat sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the documents he had left for their consideration. It won't be easy, Pat acknowledged. The Whitacres have influence and the railroad has deep pockets. Kate reached across the table, taking his hand. We've faced worse, at least now we understand what we're fighting. Pat squeezed her hand. And we're fighting it together, that makes all the difference. 2 days later, on a crisp December morning with fresh snow blanketing the ground, Kate Morgan and Patrick Garrett were married in Empire City's small church. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Miguel, Daniel, and Jack standing as witnesses alongside Mrs. Harmon and a few other town friends. Kate wore a new dress of deep blue wool, ordered specially from Cheyenne, with her mother's locket around her neck. Pat looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaved. As they exchanged vows, Kate marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the devastation of fire to the promise of a shared future, from strangers to partners to lovers. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Pat's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, she felt the last pieces of her broken world finally mend themselves into something stronger and more beautiful than before. A small reception followed at the hotel restaurant, where even those who hadn't attended the ceremony came to offer congratulations. Pat's ranch hands had decorated the space with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, creating a festive atmosphere that celebrated not just the wedding but the approaching Christmas season. Notably absent were the Whitacres, though their absence was hardly mourned by the newlyweds. More surprising was the appearance of Edward Fleming, the railroad representative, who approached them as the celebration was winding down. "Mr. and Mrs. Garrett," he greeted them formally, "my congratulations on your nuptials." Pat's arm tightened protectively around Kate's waist. "Thank you, Fleming. Unexpected to see you here." Fleming glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I came to inform you that the Railroad Commission is reconsidering the proposed route through Empire City. Recent surveys have identified an alternative path that may prove more advantageous." Kate exchanged a surprised look with Pat. "More advantageous how exactly?" "Financially, primarily. The alternative route would require less excavation and fewer bridges." Fleming hesitated. "It would also bypass your property entirely, Mrs. Garrett." Pat's expression remained cautious. What prompted this sudden reconsideration? Fleming? Montgomery's involvement, perhaps? Fleming's smile was thin. "Let's just say certain arrangements between local interests and the railroad have come under scrutiny. The commission prefers to avoid the appearance of impropriety." When he had gone, Kate turned to Pat with widened eyes. "Did that mean what I think it did?" Pat nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Montgomery must have found evidence of the Whitacres' involvement and used it as leverage. If I'm reading between the lines correctly, the railroad is distancing itself from potential scandal." "So we might keep our land without a legal battle after all," Kate marveled. "It seems so." Pat pulled her close. "A wedding gift from an unexpected source." That night, after the celebration ended and they returned to what was now their shared home, Kate and Pat stood on the porch gazing at the star-filled sky. The temperature had dropped with nightfall, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air, but neither felt the cold as they stood wrapped in each other's arms. "Happy Mrs. Garrett," Pat murmured against her hair. The name, her new name, still sounded wonderfully strange to her ears. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you, Mr. Garrett, any regrets about taking on a stubborn woman and her burned-out homestead?" Pat turned her in his arms, his expression serious despite the smile in his eyes. "The only regret I have is that it took a fire to bring you into my life. I'd have preferred to spare you that pain." Kate reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "The fire took much from me, but it gave me something greater in return. It brought me you and this life we're building together." His kiss was tender, a promise of all the nights and days to come. When they finally went inside, closing the door on the winter night, it was with the certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had built their home together, with determination, love, and the strength forged in overcoming adversity. Spring came to Wyoming territory with its usual capriciousness, days of warming sunshine interspersed with sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter relinquished its hold reluctantly in these high plains. By April, however, the land had begun its annual renewal, with tender green shoots appearing in meadows and the first wildflowers dotting the hillsides. For Kate and Pat Garrett, the months since their December wedding had been a time of adjustment and deepening love. They had divided their time between Kate's rebuilt home and the G-Bar Ranch, learning the rhythms of shared life and merged enterprises. The legal threat from the railroad had indeed evaporated, with official confirmation arriving in February that the alternative route had been approved by all necessary authorities. The Whitakers' influence in Empire City had diminished considerably after rumors of improper railroad dealings began circulating, though they remained prominent figures in the community. With spring came new beginnings in more ways than one. Kate's mare Penny delivered a healthy colt sired by Pat's best stallion, the first of what they hoped would be many successful crossings between their stock. The foal's arrival coincided with roundup time at the G-Bar, making for busy days and exhausted nights as they balanced both operations. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and pink, Kate turned to her husband with a smile that held a secret. "I think we should expand the house before winter," she said casually, watching his profile. Pat looked surprised. "Expand? It seems adequate for our needs, unless you're planning to take in boarders." His tone was teasing. "Not boarders," Kate replied, taking his hand and placing it gently over her still flat stomach, "but we will need more room by November." Pat's expression transformed as understanding dawned, first shock, then wonder, and finally unbridled joy spreading across his features. "Kate, are you saying we're going to have a baby?" she confirmed, her own happiness reflected in her eyes. "Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday when I went into town." Pat gathered her into his arms with a whoop of delight that probably startled the horses in the nearby corral. "A baby, our baby." He pulled back to look at her face, his expression suddenly concerned. "Are you feeling well? Should you be resting more?" "What did the doctor say?" Kate laughed, touched by his immediate shift to protective worry. "I'm perfectly healthy, Pat. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, many while doing far more strenuous work than I do." He relaxed slightly, but his hand remained protectively over her middle. "Still, we'll make sure you have help. Miguel's wife could come up from town to assist with the heavier chores. And we should definitely expand the house, a proper nursery with lots of windows, and maybe another bedroom for when the child is older." His enthusiasm made her heart swell. "I think that's an excellent plan, though we have several months before such accommodations are needed." Pat kissed her tenderly. "Several months to prepare for the next great adventure in our lives." His expression grew thoughtful. "You know, when I helped rebuild your home after the fire, I never imagined I was actually building our home, the place where we'd raise our family." "Life has a way of surprising us," Kate agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the last light fade from the sky. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come from the most unexpected beginnings." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Kate reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The devastating fire that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the first step on a path that led to love, partnership, and now the promise of new life. From ashes, they had built not just a home of wood and stone, but a life rich with love and possibility. Pat's arm tightened around her shoulders, as if he sensed her thoughts. "I love you, Katherine Garrett," he said softly, "more with each passing day." "And I love you," she replied, turning in his embrace to meet his lips with hers. "My cowboy, my partner, my heart." Above them, stars continued to emerge, eternal witnesses to the timeless cycle of loss and renewal, endings and beginnings, destruction and rebuilding. And in the home they had built together, Kate and Pat Garrett looked toward the future with hope and the quiet certainty that whatever it might bring, they would face it as they had faced the past together, with love as their foundation and strength as their framework. In November, as the first snows of winter began to dust the Wyoming landscape, Katherine Garrett gave birth to a healthy son with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him James Thomas Garrett, James after Kate's father, Thomas after Pat's. The expanded house, completed weeks before the birth with the help of the entire G-Bar crew, welcomed its newest resident with warm fires, sturdy walls, and the boundless love of parents who had discovered that sometimes, from the ashes of devastation, the most beautiful life can emerge.